The following story contains scenes that may be distressing to sensitive viewers. If experience has taught us anything, it's that stories on hunting are sure to divide opinion. Our next insert is not about the morality of hunting per se, but rather how it will be managed under a revised plan by government.
It's a strategy aimed at harnessing the economic potential of our biodiversity to, among other things, benefit local communities and help fund conservation. It's a wide-ranging plan that, unsurprisingly, has stirred controversy.
Published in March this year, the revised biodiversity strategy includes plans to generate income from rhino horn and ivory, as well as increasing trophy hunting. Here's 𝗀𝗧𝗏.
Imagine biodiversity as a massive treasure chest, filled with incredible animals, plants, and marine life. A biodiversity economy finds creative ways to use those treasures and at the same time conserve them. Activities that include safaris, recreational hunting, using plants for medicinal purposes to generate both money and jobs. Government has clung to this strategy for years, but brace yourself. Fresh plans to radically ramp it up on a massive scale were unveiled by the president in March.
Lying hidden like Rembrandt's or 𝗀𝗫cie𝗿𝗆𝗆 pieces lying in the attic are the endowments that our people should now utilize: the land, the plants, and everything else that is in our rural communities.
But are government's plans too ambitious? Does the strategy, as some say, have potentially devastating consequences? Dr. Hayley Clements is a senior researcher at Stellenbosch University's African Wildlife Economy Institute, and she is a firm believer in government's plan.
The strategy actually has been in place since 2016, and I think one of the main reasons for this revision is to bring it more in line with international commitments.
The Global Biodiversity Framework is a new international agreement in which all participating countries have to conserve 30% of their land by 2030. Our government has come up with a strategy to attempt to achieve this. The government's revised strategy was released as a 48-page document in March. The public were only given 2 weeks to comment, but there was a further 2 weeks extension after an outcry. Some environmental organizations were shocked by the scale of the vision, like wanting to increase revenue from all types of hunting from 4.6 billion rand to 27.6 billion rand by 2036. This includes trophy hunting, a sport that typically targets the strongest, most dominant of a species. Trophy hunting ruffles feathers. Dr. Ross Harvey, Director of Research at Good Governance Africa, thinks that's for good reason, as South Africa runs the risk of ethically minded tourists boycotting the country.
You don't know, as a tourist, whether that elephant that you're taking a photograph of today is still going to be here tomorrow. And that people are not willing to live with that kind of cognitive dissonance any longer.
The trophy hunting industry contributes significantly to our economy, and it creates thousands of jobs. But how does that money find its way back to conservation?
If it's managed well, it's actually just harvesting a very small percentage of a wildlife population that actually brings in a lot of revenue for conservation, particularly in areas where ecotourism is not very viable.
Ross disagrees.
The portion of cash that goes back into conservation from selling the licenses to trophy hunting is minimal. So this idea that hunting will generate all kinds of cash that comes at little ecological cost, that's a misnomer.
You know, I think a lot of the uproar is about trophy hunting, but that's only one tool in a big toolbox. There's a big focus on ecotourism in the strategy. There's a focus on hunting for meat, which is something that morally, I think people tend to be less opposed to. There's also a focus on bioprospecting, harvesting of wild plants, etc. So it would not be wise to focus the whole strategy on trophy hunting, and that's certainly not what it does.
On the other hand, their plan to expand conservation areas from 20 million hectares to 34 million by 2040 has been welcomed by many. The commercialization of our biodiversity could, according to government, benefit rural communities. And that would be great. But the question is the plan ecologically sustainable? Haley is confident the strategy will do just that.
And so it's saying if we give people opportunity to utilize biodiversity in sustainable ways, then they will be incentivized to conserve it.
Government strategy places rural communities at its center.
The wildlife economy so far has primarily occurred on white farm land, and the government recognizes, and rightly so, that there's really a need to grow this industry through better inclusion of emerging black farmers as well as communities that hold land.
But she emphasizes it will be up to communities not to exploit what they have.
The idea is that if they don't manage it sustainably, then they won't have a livelihood going forward.
That's not a risk Pete Reynard thinks we should take if we are serious about conservation.
I think that we're playing a game with something here that is irreplaceable.
Pete is an environmental manager and dedicated 30 years of his life to managing state-owned game reserves in KwaZulu-Natal. 2 years ago, he left KZN Conservation, exchanging it for the stark beauty of the West Coast, where he now manages a private nature reserve.
I think there should rather be a focus on, look, this is what we've got, let's fix that up first, before we start considering these very ambitious, broad plans. It is really incumbent on the government, and this is both at provincial level and at national level, to better financially resource these agencies, because that's the only way it's going to start to turn around.
Many provincial game reserves are in a state of near collapse. This new plan places oversight in the hands of provincial conservation authorities. But if they're already battling, how will they be able to implement it?
There's really one extremely important pillar that the entire possible success of the strategy rests on, and that is the concept of good governance.
And that's not something we have in abundant supply.
No, those provincial conservation agencies are under severe stress. You're placing a huge burden on an organization that is already struggling just to maintain what they're dealing with now.
Peter's also caught up on the part of the plan that seeks to increase trophy hunting.
When your trophy bull of whatever it is has been shot, it's gone. You're taking that same genetic virility that's so important for the survival of that specific species in a given environment, you're taking it out of the system. So you're not doing anybody any ecological favors through trophy hunting.
This stuff will be gone before we even know it. And it's much more important than we
In
think.
2015, 𝗀𝗵𝗆, director of the documentary Blood Lions, exposed what was happening with canned hunting on lion breeding farms. And while government recently announced their intention to shut down that industry, Ian believes we have a long way to go and that trophy hunting should be banned outright.
I don't like the sort of pure instrumental value approach to the way this government and others in Southern Africa carry out their conservation objectives. Wildlife or biodiversity and protected areas, in their eyes, only has value in terms of its benefits to humanity.
It's about breeding wildlife as intensively as they can, as quickly as they can, to make as much money as they can.
And viewing it through that lens, he believes could have a catastrophic impact.
We're going to end up farming high-value wildlife species like buffalo, sable, lion, rhino, and that's got nothing to do with biodiversity conservation. It's merely switching from farming domestic animals to farming wild animals. And by the way, if this process goes on for 20, 30 years, we then are on the road to domesticating these very species that we hold so dear and wild to us.
They didn't have any bush history.
The international trade of rhino horn or elephant ivory is currently restricted, but government wants to explore options of domestic trade. Government wants to create health clinics and sell rhino horn to tourists from the Far East, another controversial aspect of this strategy.
You're now placing a legal pressure on the resource combined with a continuing illegal pressure on the resource. And those two combined are obviously going to place more pressure on the species.
What do you make of the plans of selling powdered rhino horn to Asian tourists?
So the evidence suggests that if you allow people to utilize the species, they see value in it, those populations grow. What's happened since, of course, because of poaching, is that now it's extremely costly for the state and for the private sector to protect those rhinos from poaching. And so something's got to give, but the reality is we need additional tools to save the white rhino.
For Hayley, finding creative solutions that benefit both people and conservation is what this strategy seeks to achieve. And if it works, it could have benefits for generations to come.
I actually think it's the opposite of being detrimental to biodiversity. I think it's trying to promote biodiversity conservation across the landscape.
For Pete, there's simply too much at stake.
If this kind of strategy goes ahead full steam, you actually run the risk of over-exploitation. And that over-exploitation is going to damage brand South Africa, because our wildlife and our biodiversity, they are our country's heritage.
Thanks for watching. Why not drop us a comment below? We love reading your opinions. Remember, you can now access Carte Blanche stories anytime, anywhere, even offline. Carte Blanche, the podcast, is now available on all major podcast platforms, so be sure to hit that follow or subscribe button and be part of our growing online family.